Good afternoon, and here we are again in Victoria. No? Maybe we're not in Victoria. Oh, not officially. We're here, but... Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
At last we're in Victoria. I know that you have worked with the message of the infinite way, many of you, for a long time. And a question that must always come up is, to what extent are you benefiting by your study? To what extent are you deriving the benefits of this message? Let me say, to start with, that there are no limits to the possibilities of our demonstration. There is no limit to the good that we can bring through, because the source is spirit. The source is the eternal and the infinite spirit, which we call God. Therefore, there can be no limit to that. The limit must always be in proportion to our capacity to receive, or our capacity to understand how to bring through, how to bring forth the fruits of the Spirit. Naturally, with the years in which we've watched this message unfold, we know what the capacities are, what the capabilities are, what the potentialities are. We also know that we are not all drawing forth equally. We are not all drawing forth even a small measure of the possibilities. And so it becomes necessary once in a while for us to review the principles, to be sure that we know what the principles are. Review our understanding of those principles, and whether or not we are seeing the, how shall I call that? How shall I name that? The way, capital W-A-Y, the way. Let me illustrate. Many who have metaphysical backgrounds before they come to the infinite way find the infinite way difficult because the goals differ. In some approaches to truth, it is taught how to demonstrate, let us say, things. Demonstrate a home, or demonstrate a transportation, or demonstrate health, or demonstrate supply. Now, students who have followed such teachings for a long time find it very difficult to come into the infinite way of expression, because we don't have such teachings or such capacities or such possibilities. I would not know of any way in which we, through the infinite way, could demonstrate supply, or could demonstrate companionship, or could demonstrate a home. As a matter of fact, I believe that, and sincerely, that all such attempts would actually prove to be a barrier to the demonstration of our harmony. The reason is this: God is infinite being. And let us first take the word infinite. God is infinite. Since there cannot be anything beyond infinity, or there cannot be anything more than infinity, there really can't be any such thing as supply or home or companionship. There could only be infinity. And whatever there is has to be embraced in the infinity of spirit. Therefore, the only possibility there would be that of demonstrating spirit. Now, if you think of spirit as the substance of all that is, or as many do, think of God, and then let us go to God to get. But God is infinite, and what is there to get? There is nothing outside the limits of, or the unlimits of spirit. How could you go to spirit to get something else that doesn't exist? Therefore, the very idea of going to God for something would be the very barrier to the attainment. Let's put it another way. There is no giving God. Then how could we go to God to get God to give something? There is no such thing as a giving God. If there were a giving God, there would be God withholding, because giving would have to start at a particular moment. Now just think if you could go to God and get something this minute. You would certainly have to agree that God was withholding it a minute ago. There is no such thing. There is no such God. Think in terms of sun, moon, stars, planets. Think in terms of flowers, fruits, vegetables. Is there such a thing as God withholding any of these? Is there any such thing as God giving these things? God can't give us mountains, and God can't give us seas, because God is not withholding them. These already exist. In fact, all that is already exists. How then can God give us? It is true that if we look out at the trees today, they may be barren, but how foolish it would be to go to God and ask for leaves or flowers or fruit, when we know right well it's only necessary to be patient, and in their due time they will appear. They will appear because of the omnipresence of God, the omnipresence of good. Now, omnipresence does not mean that there will always be flowers or fruit on the particular trees. Omnipresence means that the Spirit of God is always present to make these appear in their due season. It may be that in our personal lives that for some reason we may be experiencing one of those barren periods. It doesn't mean that supply is absent, and if we could only get God, he would make it appear. God is omnipresence, and it only means that our recognition of the omnipresence of God would in due course show forth the evidence as what we call supply. Now, we think of omnipresence, and then we think in terms of the omnipresence of some form of good. It doesn't mean that. It means omnipresence of the Spirit, omnipresence of the source, omnipresence of the law, omnipresence of the life. You would make a mistake if you were to say that omnipresence means the ever-presence of roses, because roses aren't always present in evidence. They're always present in essence, not in manifested form. But the substance of the rose is always omnipresent, always present, and the recognition of the omnipresence of Spirit would bring the rose into manifestation in its due season, or the apples, or the peaches, or the plums, or the dollar bills, or the transportation, or the companionship, or the housing. But omnipresence must only be thought of as omnipresence of Spirit, omnipresence of cause, omnipresence of substance, omnipresence of life, omnipresence of activity. Then, when you think in the terms of omnipresence, you take no thought for what you shall eat, or what you shall drink, or wherewithal you shall be clothed, because your only taking thought should be the acknowledgement of the omnipresence of Spirit, the omnipresence of life, and then let that realization of omnipresence manifest itself as what you shall eat or drink, or wherewithal you shall be clothed, in its due time, not in what you call your due time, in its due time. In our human experience, we sometimes seem to have to wait a while. It is very much like healing. Actually, all healing is instantaneous. There is no such thing as delayed healing or gradual healing. All healing is instantaneous, but the outward sign doesn't always appear in the second of the healing. For instance, if we were to receive a treatment in this moment that actually brought healing, we may not be aware of the healing till tomorrow or next week. Let us just assume, for instance, that we have a stoppage somewhere in our system. And we receive a treatment, we receive help. Even if the healing is instantaneous, it may take hours or days or weeks for that blockage, whatever it was, to evaporate, dissolve, and disappear. Or an experience that I have witnessed recently, where a child was born with a bone missing from its body, and help was asked, and in less than 2 months that bone has fully developed and grown. But the healing was instantaneous. It merely took these 2 months for that bone to gradually form, harden, and appear. But none of this could have taken place if the healing hadn't taken place first. In other words, the formation of the bone and the appearing of it, the hardening of it, that was a process in human experience that was the effect of a healing. So it is with us. We may, for instance, have a claim of lack or limitation in some form, receive help, and the healing may take place instantaneously, and it may be a week before something turns up in our mail or our experience with a necessary amount of dollar bills or whatever fulfillment may have been. But it doesn't say because it took us a day, a week, or a month to see the completed outer picture of demonstration, that the demonstration wasn't instantaneously made, because the visible evidence is the effect of the healing. It isn't the healing. The healing is invisible, but the visible evidence is the externalized or manifested effect. Now, in the same way, if in your spiritual life or in your infinite way life, if you are thinking of some form of good that you're seeking, you are setting up a barrier that may separate you from it, and will separate you from it until you stop that nonsense of setting up the form of the demonstration that you desire. In other words, what you would like to see made manifest. There is only one right desire on the path of the infinite way, and that is the desire for the realization of spirit, for the realization of divine harmony or divine grace. The only demonstration that is possible at all in the infinite way is the demonstration of God's presence. And those who expect anything else of this message will be disappointed. There is no way to turn to this message and think in terms of demonstrating anything or any condition. There is only one thing to be demonstrated, and that is the presence of God. Now, the presence of God is fulfillment. In thy presence is fullness of life, fullness of joy, fullness of good. Therefore, once you demonstrate the presence of God, you will find the good unfolding in infinite form and variety. But seeking the form and variety will be the barrier to the demonstration. In other words, God being infinite, there is no demonstration to make but the demonstration of infinite God or infinite good. Again, we do not give sufficient thought to that passage about, I do not know how to pray, I do not know how to go out or how to come in, I do not know what things to pray for. We believe we know a little bit more than the writers of Scripture. And therefore, we are sure we know what to pray for, what things we have need of. Throughout all time, people have been praying for things and for conditions and for persons. And if all of that had been successful, there never would have been the start of a new religious era. The old one would have sufficed. We would have continued in the old way. But it wasn't satisfactory. It didn't turn out the way it was promised, and it is for this reason that wherever you travel in the world, people are seeking. People are actually seeking. And why should they be seeking if what they have been taught was the way? if it was bringing the fruitage into their experience that we all desire. But we know the answer. We know that either the teaching was wrong or our understanding of the teaching was wrong, and a little of both comes in there. I do know that many, many wonderful teachers and teachings have existed in the world, and that they have been misunderstood and misinterpreted. And so it is that it isn't always the teachings or the teachers, it isn't always the churches or their revelations, but the way in which these things are understood. Well, we have the same idea today when many are trying new religious teachings, but bringing into them all their old mistaken concepts of God and of prayer, and wondering why they do not work. God does not answer prayer in the sense of giving us the things we pray for the simple reason that there is no such God, and secondly, that very often they wouldn't be good for us to receive if we received them. Each one of us, sooner or later, must gain an entirely new concept of God. Whatever concept we have heretofore entertained is not going to do us much good, because if it didn't bring about our good before, don't think for a minute that the same concept of God we entertained will do anything more for us today than it did for us before. I remember some years ago a woman coming to my office, and nothing seemed to happen in her life. Here she was with a new religion, and it wasn't doing any more for her than her old religion. And no matter what she did, no matter what her practitioners did, nothing seemed to turn out for her. And one day in my office, I'm sure that it was an inspiration, I said to her, "Tell me, what do you think about God? I mean, do you have the same God now that you had in your old church? Do you pray to God in the same way you prayed in your old church?" Oh, she said, "I don't pray the same way because now I affirm and I deny, whereas I used to ask." Yes, I know, but are you affirming and denying to the same God? Is it a God you're expecting to give you? Oh, yes, God doesn't change. It's the same God. There's only one God. Well, I said, I'm afraid that's where you're stuck. There is only one God, but you haven't met him. And until you give up that concept of God that you formerly had, you're going to get the same reaction from that concept, whether you beg, plead, or affirm and deny. And it'll be the same concept if you give up affirming and denying. The result will be nothing, because you are worshiping a God that doesn't exist. There is no God that can give you. There is no God that can send you the things you would like. The God is omnipresence. The God is spirit. The God is law. The God is life. The God is a spirit in man. It does not obey man. It does not heed man's requests. It will not listen to your pleas. It will not grant you favors. You cannot influence the God, the one true God. You cannot bribe. the one true God. You cannot sacrifice and make this God do something. You cannot beg, plead, and implore, and affirming and denying won't have any more effect on God than begging and pleading did. Therefore, you will have to change your concept of God until you attain the realization of a God that is, and a God that is being, a God that is eternally being God, without any urging from you, without any asking or begging, or without any affirming or denying, a God that is infinite in being, omnipresent in being, omnipotent in being, omniscient in being. Now think, if God is omniscient in being, you don't have to tell it something. It is the all-knowing wisdom, intelligence of the universe. If it is omnipotent in being, it's the all-power. If it is omnipresence, it is here where I am. What more is there in prayer than knowing this truth? Ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. What more can you know, and what more can you care about than knowing that God is all-knowing, all-power, and always present? Can there be more than that to prayer? Can there be more than that to realization? If we're going to go further and say, now I've got God here, I'm going to tell him something, we're denying omniscience. If we say, now I have God here, closer to me than breathing, I'm going to ask him for something, we're accusing him of withholding. We're denying the love nature of God. We're denying that he knoweth what things we have need of, and that it is his good pleasure to give us the kingdom. Therefore, we must come to a whole new concept of God. We must make a transition from whatever former concept we have. And here in another way, practically everyone has, regardless of what their religious background may have been, or even if they had none, they've absorbed in the air the belief that God is a great power that's going to do something to evil. You have to give up that concept of God. God isn't going to do anything to evil. God isn't going to do anything today that God wasn't doing yesterday. God isn't going to be any different a century from now than God was a century ago. God isn't going to be any different on the shores of Galilee 2,000 years ago than God is today. If anyone thinks there was more of God on the shores of Galilee 2,000 years ago than there is today, they're not acquainted with the history of the Holy Lands and of Egypt and of Rome. There was just as much evil in the world in the days of Jesus Christ on earth as there are evils in this world today, and probably a few more, because we have made some advances in man's humanity to man. We have made some advances in loving our neighbor as ourself. We do have nations on earth today that help each other. We do have individuals on earth today that help each other of different nationalities, colors, races, and creeds. They had very little of that in those days. Each nation lived unto itself, each race lived unto itself, each religion lived unto itself, and they were all warring with each other. We have plenty of wars today and threats of wars, but underneath it all, we have far more understanding of each other, even among races, religions, and nationalities than existed 2,000 years ago. As a matter of fact, probably the Hebrew people themselves were more divided among themselves than we're even divided between whites or blacks or Christians, Muslims, or Jews. Oh no, we have made tremendous advances in 2,000 years, so that for anyone to believe for a moment that there was more of God on earth then than now means that they must change their concept of God and realize that there is just as much God today, just as much God right here in this room as there was on the shores of Galilee. We may not, any one of us, have the same degree of realization of it that the Master had. We may not even attain some of the degree of realization that some of the disciples may have had. We know so little about that. But one thing we do know is that God cannot be less right here in this room than if we were sitting on the shores of Galilee 2,000 years ago. God is omnipresence now as then. God is omnipotence now as then. God is omniscience now as then. And this isn't denying the Master's teaching. This is confirming it. Before Abraham was, I am. He never claimed that God only began on earth with his ministry. Before Abraham, before the beginning of the Hebrew race, thousands of years ago, I am on earth. I was on earth. And I will be with you unto the end of the world. I will never leave thee nor forsake thee. But do you not see that if you are not manifesting that same degree of God in your experience that you could have manifested 2,000 years ago had you been sitting with the Master, it is not because of an absence of God, but because of your erroneous concept of what God is, where God is, when God is, what God is. It all deals with you. When you acknowledge omnipresence, when you acknowledge omnipotence and omniscience, when you acknowledge that the kingdom of God is closer to you than breathing and nearer than hands and feet, and then trust the governing of your life to that omnipresence without telling it, advising it, or in any wise trying to inform it, when you completely relax in the realization that the Spirit of God dwells in you, and that you can take the same attitude that Jesus took, or Paul, I of my own self can do nothing, but the Father within me doeth the works, or Paul, I live yet not I, Christ liveth my life. Now, ask yourself whether you have attained the realization of the omnipresence of God and the letting of God live your life. Or to what degree are you still trying to mold God into your image and likeness? To what degree are you still trying to be sure that you let God know what you need and on what day and in what form? God is spirit, and a prayer is a recognition of that. God is spirit, and God's life is spiritual. God's law is spiritual. God's way is spiritual. And therefore, since you cannot, through the human mind, know the meaning of spirit, you can only relax and let that Spirit do its work. The natural man receiveth not the things of God. The human mind can never become aware of the nature of God. The human mind can never know the way of God, how God operates. You can take a seed. You can plant it in the earth. And these days you can get a microscope of sufficient power so that you can aim it right down through that earth at the seed and watch that seed break open and watch that seed develop and show forth eventually a sprout, take root in the ground, and eventually send shoots up through the earth. You can see all of that, but you cannot see the spirit that made it happen. You can see the effect of nature. You can see the effect of life operating on and in and through a seed. You can see all that happens to the seed right up until it has apples hanging off of its branches, but never can you see, know, or understand what made it happen. All you can say is an invisible something was at work. And that invisible something broke the seed open. That invisible something fed that seed or sent food into it from its surrounding earth. And that invisible something turned that food into an essence of some kind. That's all you can ever know. That's how indefinite the whole subject of God must forever remain. We know that there is life. We know by the effect that there is God. For instance, there is harmony in this room. There is peace in this room. Why? Because there is God in this room. And the peace and the harmony that's in this room is an effect. And you can't see what caused it. If you look around here and see men and women, and if you were from the outside world, you'd say, it's surprising that you can all be so friendly and so loving and so sharing and cooperative with each other over a long period of years and not have fights and lawsuits and troubles. No, look back over our groups through the years and see the love and the friendship and the sharing and the devotion and the absence of lawsuits and the absence of strife and the absence of adultery, and then ask yourself what makes it possible. And the answer is, we have submitted ourselves to God. We have surrendered ourselves to God, and God is functioning in us and through us in our relationships, and there is love here. But you can't see what caused it. You can see a person's friendliness. You can see the generosity. You can see their sharingness, but you can't see what caused it. Why? Because God is invisible. But if God weren't omnipresent, it couldn't take place. You say then, why isn't it taking place out in the rest of the world? Because there isn't the realization of omnipresence. Out in the rest of the world, they either have no God, or they have a God they're going to meet after they die, or they're going to have a God that'll help them after they get to be good. In other words, all they're doing is separating themselves from God. It is very much like a subject that came up one time on the subject of the Christ, and I found myself saying this, that the Hebrews do not have the Christ. And the reason is they are waiting for the coming of the Messiah or Christ. And therefore, in waiting for Christ to come, they haven't got him. And I said the Christians also haven't Christ. They are equally without Christ, just as equally so as the Hebrews. Why? The Christians are waiting for the second coming of the Christ. And therefore, they have an absent Christ. And so the absent Christ is no good to the Hebrews, and the absent Christ is no good to the Christians. Christ only becomes born, conceived alive in you with the recognition of omnipresence. Here where I am, Christ is. The Christ promise is, I will never leave you nor forsake you. I was with you before Abraham, and I will be with you to the end of the world. Therefore, when you claim Christ, you have Christ. If you don't claim Christ, you are either the Hebrew who's waiting for the coming of Christ, or the Christian who's waiting for the second coming, but in both cases, not present. And if Christ isn't present for one of those two reasons, it makes no difference which reason you use. You still have no Christ present. Therefore, you have to change your concept and stop being the Hebrew who's waiting for Christ, and you have to stop being the Christian who's waiting for the second coming of Christ, and you have to be an individual who recognizes that closer to me than breathing, nearer than hands and feet, is the Christ, the Son of God, the Spirit of God, indwelling. I can do all things through the indwelling Christ in me. Not the Christ who hasn't come, and not the Christ for whom I'm waiting, but the indwelling Christ. Ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. Change your concepts and begin to recognize omnipresence. Omnipresence here where I am, omniscience, the all-knowing, omnipotence, the all-power, and then relax. Relax and be. From then on, all there is to do is to be. That is, to awaken in the morning in the realization, I am living. I am here. I am now. And the Spirit of God that dwells in me goes before me to perfect this day. This is the day the Lord hath made. This is the day. I have only to live this day, but He performeth all that is given me to do. He perfecteth that which concerneth me. My function is to be and to bear witness. I can bear witness that a minute from now and an hour from now, my good will unfold from an invisible source, by an invisible power, operating on the visible universe. I do not know what my good will be an hour from now. Humanly, I have made my plans, but those plans were only in accord with what seemed to be right. I am perfectly willing, if something takes place in the next 5 minutes or the next hour or two, to change those plans. Perfectly willing, perfectly at peace, knowing that I am not supposed to have rigid plans of my own. I am supposed always to be in an atmosphere of, speak, Lord, thy servant heareth. Thy presence goes before me. Let me be alert, awake, to see what is to take place every minute of every hour of every day. When I awaken in the morning, it is God that brought up the sun. It is God that awakened the buds and starts to bring them out into full bloom. It is God that is invisibly working to put fruit on the tree. Well, the same God is invisibly working in me to bring forth God's fruitage as my individual life. An apple tree is supposed to bring forth apples, and a peach tree is to bring forth peaches, and I am to bring forth some phase of God's glory. But so are you. We are those trees. We are of the tree of life. But we're not all supposed to be mothers, and we're not all supposed to be fathers. We're not all supposed to be businessmen. We're not all supposed to be ministers or practitioners. Each one of us is to show forth God's glory in an individual way. And who am I to dictate to God or say what I would like to be, or what I would like to do, or where I would like to do it? No. But if I awaken in the morning with the realization, just think, God functioned through the night to bring forth day. God is functioning now in the closed buds to bring them out into full bloom. God is functioning in the branches of the tree to bring out leaves, or to bring out blossoms, or to bring out fruit. God is even functioning in the barren trees, so that next spring there will be leaves and blossoms and fruits. How can we deny this who have watched it year after year after year? We have watched the seasons change, and we have watched the days and the nights, the winters and the summers. How can we deny that there is an invisible presence or life or power acting intelligently on the visible universe? Then how is it possible that we cannot accept an invisible, all-knowing God, capable of operating invisibly in us and through us to bring forth fruits, harmony, peace? Therefore, having this higher concept of God, God is spirit, all-knowing, God is spirit, all-loving, God is spirit, all-presence, God is spirit, all-power, why can we then not rest more, relax more in the assurance of this, and just live our lives, knowing that each hour, whatever is necessary, will come forth in its season, and always being patient, knowing that patience must have its perfect work. It must. Now, one of the barriers, then, is the fact that even though we know every truth that I've just said, we don't bring it to conscious remembrance each day. We let this truth lie dormant in the back of our mind instead of praying without ceasing. Now here comes a little secret. Nothing can come into your experience except through your consciousness. Look around this room and you will see that without us in this room, it's just a vacant room. Nothing happening because it's a vacant room. We come into this room. Now, what is going to happen in this room is determined by our state of consciousness. If there is peace and harmony and love in this room, do you not see that it is our consciousness being externalized as peace and harmony and wholeness? And do you not see that if there is disruption, chaos, sin, do you not see that it must be our state of consciousness externalizing itself? Nothing could happen in this room except as the externalization of our consciousness. The room itself can't do anything or be anything. Our bodies can't move. They just cannot move. Our bodies are as dead as the table. It is our consciousness that moves us to be charitable or be stingy. It is our consciousness that moves us to be sinful or to be pure. It is our consciousness that moves us to be sharing, cooperative. It is our consciousness that moves us to be forgiving, loving, sharing. Therefore, Without consciousness, nothing can take place. The next thing is, what consciousness? Let's first agree then that consciousness is the basic secret of life. In other words, my hands can't give or take. My hand can't pet or punch. Just a dead hand. But when consciousness animates it, then it can begin to move, it can begin to do, and so with the whole body. Consciousness must animate it. Now the question is, what is the body going to do? What is our life going to be like? That depends on what we entertain in consciousness. If we entertain the idea of omnipresent God, if we entertain the idea of omnipresent intelligence, love, power, nothing's going to take place in this room but absolute good, absolute perfection, because we are not going to do anything. We're just going to be still and let that omnipresence flow. We are not going to take thought. We're not going to plan anything. We're just going to live friendly, or whatever flows through, and it's going to be good. It's going to be love. It's going to be abundance. It's going to be forgiveness. It's going to be generosity. It's going to be every quality of God. Why? Because that's what we are entertaining in consciousness is God. We don't have to think generosity. We don't have to think forgiveness. We don't have to think abundance. We only have to remember omnipresence. That's all we have to do, is abide in the word omnipresence or omniscience or omnipotence. And then we have lost all capacity for anything but God. And then God flows through. And all of a sudden, we find ourselves being loving or generous or kind or pure, but we never took thought about it. We never expected to do something or be something. It automatically flowed. Why? Because we were entertaining omnipresence. Now, do you know that in a consciousness that is not imbued with omnipresence, do you know what is there? Take the word God out of your consciousness, and you know what you have left? Fear, ignorance, superstition, desire, anxiety, concern, give me, help me, I, me, mine. The moment God is absent from your consciousness, you are a human being. You are what Paul called a creature, who is not under the law of God, neither indeed can be. You are the natural man, the mortal man, the animal man, who receiveth not the things of God. Any individual without a consciousness filled with God has to have part good in them and part bad, part confidence and part hopelessness, part sin and part purity, part giving and part taking. They can't help it. They just can't help it, because without infinite good there's a combination of good and evil. Without the omnipresence of life, they've got to have part death, and that means sin and disease. Because without the fullness of life, you've got disease. Only in the fullness of life do you have the fullness of health, wholeness, completeness. Then if you do not have a consciousness imbued with God, you've got a human life made up partly of good and partly of evil, part of accident and part no accident. everything. It is only when consciousness is filled with the presence of God that nothing else, nothing can enter that defileth or maketh a lie. Holding good thoughts will not be a protection to you. I know that. I've watched it too many years. The only thing that will be a protection is holding thought on God. Thou wilt keep him in perfect peace whose mind is stayed on thee. There's no use thinking of safety or security. There's no use thinking thoughts of abundance. They'll never bring it to you. There's only one thing will bring it to you. Thou wilt keep him in perfect peace whose mind is stayed on thee, on omnipotence, omnipresence, omniscience. Thou wilt keep him in perfect peace whose mind is stayed on thee. A consciousness imbued with God is a consciousness full of love, full of life, full of forgiveness, full of sharing, full of peace on earth, full of no bigotries, no biases, no prejudices. You can't have a mind full of God and not understand that all mankind is really God in manifestation. All mankind is really the children of God. They're not all acting like it because they're in ignorance of their true identity, just as we were before we were awakened. We were just like the rest of the world. We were just as mean one day and nice the next day, just as giving one day and withholding the next day, just as confident one day and fearful the next day as the rest of the world. And probably we would have agreed with these people who are saying it's all right to have a gun in your bomb-proof shelter so as to shoot your neighbor if they try to get in. We may have even believed that they were right. Why? Because in the human picture, there's only one law operates. Self-preservation is the first law of nature, the first law of human nature. And therefore, what more natural, if you're a human being, than to say, why, it's perfectly legal to kill you if you try to take my dollar bills. Why, I'm perfectly justified in shooting you if you want some of my food or some of my shelter. Can't you see that back in that old human mind you might have thought the same? Today you'd be horrified. Today you'd be horrified. You'd say, how can that be? How can I want what I deny my neighbor? How can I ever want what I deny my neighbor? Therefore, let's all have it together or none. But certainly not let me have it while you have nothing. You see, the whole difference in our nature, and you know, this is very surprising. As you know, I recently sent out a letter on this subject of bomb-proof shelters. And it's gone out into more than 3,000 homes. And do you know that I haven't had one single letter from any student saying that you changed my mind or I'm glad you said that because I didn't know what to do? Not one. Every single letter of thanks that's come to me says, I'm so glad you sent that out into the world. I didn't need it, but I'm sure there are people out in the world did. In other words, everyone who has come to any kind of a spiritual light at all knows how horrible it would be, first of all, to live the rest of your life down in a cave as if you were burrowing around in the ground, and how horrible it would be to deny your neighbor something and then still go to church and say, love thy neighbor as thyself, but carry a gun. Do you see what I'm saying? That if your mind is filled with God, nobody has to tell you how to act. Because there's no way for you to act. There's only a way for God to act in you and through you. We're going to have a rest for a little while.